Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. I have Kiernan Fiore with me today, and she is one of my favorite people. And she's been on one of our
Likewise.
most listened to podcast episodes called the Neoclassical versus Classical Education. And so we are here, we're going to talk and dive deeply into curriculum and standards. And what does that look like in a classical school? We've been having a lot of questions, the two of us, for the last, well, many years about
Yes.
curriculum and hearing a lot of different ideas about what curriculum is. With all the work we've been doing, even in Australia, the way they define curriculum is different than the way we define it. And so it's also different in classical education. So we're going to talk about this today. And so, Kiernan, I'm super happy and excited that I know you have a very busy schedule. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Oh, truly my pleasure. I mean, getting to talk to you is a treat, Adrian.
So I want to just dive straight into the very basic question is what is curriculum? Um, because I recently heard a teacher say that she just realized she's been studying classical education for a few years, and she said she just realized that it's not the curriculum that guides the classroom instruction. It's the philosophy that guides the classroom instruction. And she says, I wish I would have known that before I spent all that money on curriculum, right?
Yes, yes.
So let's dive into what is curriculum and what is its function in a classical education model.
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. It's interesting. You and I have been corresponding about this some, and I have recently had an aha moment because for those who maybe have heard me before, I grew up homeschooled in the classical movement, so that's my default for what curriculum is. So when you say to me, "What is curriculum?" what I immediately think of is the books you are reading. I do not mean textbooks, but my vision of curriculum, like if you would have asked me when I was growing up, and I actually remember this, people asking my mother what curriculum she used. And it was a book list. Like, well, we're reading these books this year. And so the curriculum was everything contained in these books, but also it could never be everything contained in these books because can you get everything out of Jane Eyre or everything out of the Handbook of Nature Studies in 1 year? No, but that's the curriculum. So to me, a curriculum is a book list. The book list is age appropriate. And so I'm just starting with like this is my default. This is my assumption, and it's only been recently as I have sort of had conversations where I'll think, oh, something was definitely lost in translation there. I said to use your curriculum, and you were not doing what I thought you were going to do when I gave you that advice, which means you did not understand me. And my role at Holy Innocence is really this role of teacher coaching, mentoring, and working specifically with curriculum. And I've increasingly realized, oh, this is not everyone's default. When they hear me say, use your curriculum, they hear standards and they go back to their state standards and they say, my curriculum is that students will be able to know and tell all the planets of the solar system. But when I said use your curriculum, I meant read the book that I gave you, which will talk about the planets. It'll talk about bigger ideas than the planets. Most students, after reading that book, would be able to tell you all the planets in the solar system. Though you may have some who are, maybe struggling learners. They may be only able to tell you most of the planets, but that's okay because we will have talked about the big idea of astronomy, of how the solar system works, of how it affects us. Probably we will have had a stargazing night because my class was so into it and they loved the book. Probably this book in science or in nature study goes along with a fiction reading that you were doing. So the students will probably be talking about both books, right? That's what I had in mind when I said use your curriculum. But someone else immediately goes back to the standards. And then I will find myself, with a whole class who they just spent a whole week with flashcards memorizing the planets for a test. And I'll think, oh, no, 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 this is not what I meant. But so at its most basic level, and that's not to say curriculum isn't more than that, but I think on a practical level, that's what it means to me. When I, as a classical teacher, think about my curriculum for fourth grade, I think, what books am I reading um, for my fourth grade class? Now, obviously, I am going to think about what curriculum I have for skills like mathematics or phonics and things like that. But even that, I am going to think about how I'm teaching the skills in the context of the books that I'm reading. That even that I'm going to be saying, well, is my spelling curriculum, let's say I have rigs, is this going to work well with Little House in the Big Woods and Farmer Boy? Do I need to make it more specific? Because that's my curriculum.
So I definitely agree with you about the curriculum is the books. I also think that we can look at nature outside as the curriculum. I'm sure you agree with that.
Yes.
That's another curriculum, especially for
Yes.
science. Yeah, right.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I know you well enough to know that you believe that. And I also, interestingly, recently had an email from a teacher that said, again, like you said, that's so interesting. They said curriculum is the standards because she said to me that she sees standards and benchmarks as the curriculum and the roadmap. And I thought, well, and she knew, she said, I don't think that's what it means in classical education. So help me understand what that means. And I said, right. So in classical education, the curriculum is not a standard or a benchmark. It is the curriculum is the living ideas and it helps us to make the relational connections.
Yes. And the standards come with that.
Right.
If they have a relationship with the planets, if they've read this book and they've done stargazing and all these things, then of course they remember the names of the planets. They're friends with the planets, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's not about not learning the names of the planets or not learning the letters of the alphabet, but about there being more and not
Mhm.
missing the relational ideas. Now, it is going to look different though.
Right. Right. Yeah. So can you what did you say well, since that teacher has said that to you, how have you changed what you're communicating regarding curriculum and standards?
So for me, the key to this, and I owe so much of this to kind of your work in this, is the idea of logocentric education. That we start with logocentric. I really think that that is the key philosophical switch that helps us understand, because standards are about a particular way of segmenting information, a particular way of saying, well, these individual facts. And it's not logocentric or word centric in the way, um, if we go back to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, right? Christ as the Word. That God, our knowledge of God, is not encompassed by the law, the Ten Commandments. That's not all there is to know about God. And that the Ten Commandments are a real gift from God, but there's so much more to know about God. And that is who Christ is. He's the incarnate Word of God. So to me, this is where we begin to rethink curriculum. That if our curriculum is logocentric, it's word centered. So that does mean that, again, as with the Ten Commandments, there are standards, rules. That there are. We do need students to learn how to read. We shouldn't have 11th graders who can't do division, right? I'm not
Right.
saying, no one in classical education is saying that we shouldn't do that. What we're saying, I think we're echoing the Apostle Paul, that when the Apostle Paul says the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that is just such a small part of what we're doing. And
Mm.
so our curriculum is word centered, it's logocentric. And that means we're centered on the books, but the real things, in the same way that Christ, the Word, is the Word of God in the sense of of word, but also in the sense of logos, logic. And Christ is an incarnate person. So in that sense, I agree. Our curriculum, to me, the question of nature studies, what's our curriculum? Well, what grows in your area? What trees are
Right.
in your school, right? What are the seasons like where you live? What's the weather like? Those are the key questions.
Yes. So Kieran, with that, I know that one of the things that teachers feel apprehensive about when they're new to classical education is the confidence that they're meeting standards, because they do feel like, well, I'm not sure what a third grader should be learning or what benchmarks they should be attaining. And what do you say to that? Because I know that teachers have to take grades, they have to have some kind of standard that they have to follow. How do you address that with your teachers?
So, okay, I think this is a real nervousness because it can and does happen. I think that anyone who has been a first year teacher has had the experience of, your class was supposed to know how to do, we'll take long division, and you're a first year teacher and you don't get to it and then you feel bad because they don't know. I want to acknowledge that this is a real fear, but I think that standards are ultimately, and this is how so much of our modern educational establishment is, they're a band-aid to this. That we are worried that teachers won't teach all of the key concepts maybe or skills. So we give them lists to tick off. And I think in order to really explain why this isn't a solution to this problem for us as teachers, why this ultimately actually makes our work smaller, is to think about it. There's a big sort of thing on the internet talking about mental load. That there's doing all the items on the list, but what about the person who makes the list? That is a separate and perhaps more difficult level of work, because the person who makes the list, they have to have the whole picture in their mind. So the person making the shopping list, they have to think about what they're making for all the meals, who's going to cook the meals, when they need to be ready, what the budget is for that week. That person has the whole picture. And then all of the individual details, they've made the list, but the list is not the whole picture. The list is a tiny part of the whole picture. If teachers think of curriculum as the standards, then ultimately they are not saying the work of teaching is the cultivation of the whole child. They're like an Instacart driver going and buying the groceries. But really, as teachers, that's not our work. Our work is the cultivation of the whole child. So the job is actually a lot more difficult than that. We have to think about developmentally for fourth graders. There are certain skills that they should have, certain knowledge that they should have, but overall, how are they being developed as a person? And that's where that's why the book list to me is curriculum, because the book list takes all of that into account. A
That's
book
true.
list takes into account that some students, in fourth grade, they are not ready for the abstract mathematical thinking of algebra. So we are not doing the physics of astronomy. So we need a book that's going to introduce the non-mathematical pieces of astronomy for students. We need it written at the level of students who have only been reading for a few years. We need it at the developmental level of prepubescent children. Okay, well, now all of a sudden, creating a book list is truly thinking about the whole child, his development. We have put standards in that for example, the solar system is much more appropriate to second grade or third grade or fourth grade than kindergarten. Why? Well, because in kindergarten they're still learning the names for all the things around them. They're not ready to learn the names for planets. But see, once again, we're actually thinking about the whole child and the cultivation of that whole child as a person, and that is the work of pedagogy. That's what it is to be a teacher. So for my new teachers, what I tell them is, um, particularly new teachers, I do tell them, I'm not saying you do not have to teach the standards. I'm not saying that if there's a standard that says students should be able to articulate the difference between living and non living, they should be able to do that. Your kindergartners should be able to tell us that, a plant is alive and a rock isn't alive. But if that's all you accomplished, you're not teaching yet. you're not doing the work of teaching yet. Now, this is where the books guide you, because if you enter into a relationship with these living books with students, they will be able to tell the difference between living and non living. And you actually will begin doing the work of teaching because the book will guide you into that. The conversation will guide you into that because teaching is relational. And so you will begin practicing the art of having a relationship with children in this way. So I think, I guess in that sense, my answer is twofold. On the one hand, particularly for new teachers, the standards can be maybe one way that we help teachers understand what's developmentally appropriate. I don't know that it's the best way, but for administrators who are familiar with them, maybe it's a place to begin. Um, but for any teacher who has experience beyond 1 year, if they are reducing their work to I'm covering the standards, they're not they're not teaching, because teaching is relational. It's about ideas, it's about the whole person. They should be asking themselves, what ideas unite these standards? And so I was having this conversation with my preschool teacher and kindergarten teacher this summer. We were talking about, we have this we have this list of standards for our preschool that is just, and it misses the mark for what preschool is even about. It will list standards like, um, children will learn to interact with rhythm and music through their bodies. What this means is, if you know preschool children, you know that they have a need to move, and that we can introduce them to music. One way that they can interact with music is through motion, through dancing. Isn't this, if we just thought about the whole child, we would say, wow, preschool age children, if our curriculum was the music they listen to, if that's how we thought of curriculum, we would say, well, for preschoolers, they're going to need to move to this music. They can't sit still. They're going to listen to this and they're going to want to move, and that's going to be good. And do you see? If we approach it from the standard, it actually sounds ridiculous.
Right. Because it's in the nature of a child.
Yes, but if we approach it from, well, children should have a feast, a rich feast of books, music, art, nature. How should preschoolers interact with music? Then we'll say, oh, they should dance to it because that's what's natural. That's what preschoolers are going to want to do. This is going to help them interact with that, help them feel the rhythm. But it's different for eighth graders. Eighth graders are more mature. They might dance some, but more likely they're going to do other things. They're going to interact in different ways. And so if we start with what is listening to Carnival of the Animals like with just one age as opposed to with another age, then all of a sudden our curriculum, we're going to actually end up covering those standards. That standard in preschool, we cover that. But if we approach it from covering that standard, you know what we could end up doing? We could end up just finding YouTube videos that have random songs, maybe Baby Shark, and then we've covered the standard, right? And but I think no teacher that I've ever met would say that is a sufficient way to meet that standard. Right? Every teacher would have a desire that they're actually beginning to understand rhythm, but the standard isn't encompassing that. And so I think on the one hand, for brand new teachers and administrators who feel this nervousness, um, if they feel this nervousness, I'm going to jettison the standards completely. No, um, you're not going to jettison your muscular system or your skeletal system, but neither are you going to say that the whole child is his bones. And so ultimately, if we truly want to engage in an active pedagogy, we're going to have to step back and ask the question, what books, art, music are appropriate to children at this developmental level? What ways would children at this developmental level engage with this? And along the way, we'll see that they cover the standards. And to me, this is unfailing that if we think about, and this is why logocentric and living books is so key. If we have Little House in the Big Woods, and we're also teaching 19th century America, right? We just need to, the teacher who gets really caught up in trying to help children understand how all the mechanics of how families moved out west, or even, and I've encountered this even in classical schools where teachers are, giving these really long short answer tests about covered wagons and the Oregon Trail. This is, we have not moved into real classical education yet, because real classical education is going to start with, if you read the Little House series with a group of elementary aged students, if you read it, you narrate it, if you look at pictures from the time period, let's find some art from this time period, and you engage in lots of discussion about it. If you do written narrations, those children will cover all those standards.
That's
They
right.
will learn more,
Right. That's
but you
true.
have actually thought about the whole child, and that's what pedagogy is. And so
That's true.
I think that it's not to say we're not covering those standards, but we're doing so much more.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was rereading the Mortimer Adler of the Paideia Proposal. It's such a good little book. It
It
really is
is.
practical, and he does address the same thing. And he addresses that the teacher really needs to not be doing all the talking, but really asking questions, engaging the students in conversations, but not lecturing them so much. And he
Yes.
talks about that in here. And and one of the things I think that happens with teachers is they feel like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to teach when we read this chapter from Little House on the Prairie. So they'll go get a teachers pay teachers, and they'll print off a lesson, or they feel like they have to have a study guide for Little House on the Prairie. And I remember walking into a classical school that we were helping, and it was their first year teaching classically. And oh, the person with me who was observing, we both could not even believe, like, because we had told her, all you have to do is read the book and narrate, read the book and narrate. And we go in there, and she has this triple Venn diagram on the board to talk about the differences of the types of doors, because Pa is building a new door on their house. And how is the door on that house different from the doors on our house today? And that was the discussion. And the children, you could see their eyes were glossed over. They were bored out of their mind. And if
Yeah.
that's what they think reading a living book is supposed to be doing, I don't understand. But I mean, was she putting that up there because the standard was that students should be able to compare and contrast?
Yes. Exactly. Exactly. But so this is, I think that this is where the philosophy does drive this, and a true understanding of the philosophy will drive us thinking about curriculum differently. And so, in that sense, if we are needing the standards as a crutch, again, I'm not saying that classical education doesn't cover standards. We do. We are doing it totally differently and in a way that actually does more than the standards do, and is actually better at accommodating for different students at different levels. The reason why we have the issue in education that we do with, well, teachers need to know how to, accommodate up. They need to know how to differentiate. This has come about because we have lost what education is actually about. Differentiation is inherent in a really good understanding of how curriculum should work. Because if you read Little House in the Big Woods with your class and you narrate it, and you have some great art of prairie expansion that goes along with it, you will cover all the standards you need to. You will naturally differentiate. And you don't need to have this fear that I'm missing something along the way. And I think this is where great literature is really important. It's, my husband and I were doing a course on Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen is one of these authors. Shakespeare is one of these authors. And in the editors of the first folio say this about Shakespeare, that in the first folio, they say that he will teach you how to read his own work. And it's true. Reading Shakespeare teaches you how to read Shakespeare. And I will say that this is where, and I'm not just saying this because I'm an English teacher, I have truly seen reading literature can help us learn how the curriculum should work across the curriculum. So it's actually not about, I keep using Little House in the Big Woods as the example. It's not about Little House in the Big Woods, but it's that really reading Little House in the Big Woods and just reading it and narrating it and watching how, if we ask students questions first, what do you notice? What do you wonder about? What does this remind you of? And listening, really listening, and really continuing to ask and continuing to draw them out, we will see how well equipped their minds are to know. They will get more out of that book than we would if we had something from Teachers Pay Teachers, or
It's
if
true.
we drilled into the standards. Um,
So,
that, and I just want to add to that, that along the way in doing that, we will then understand, oh, if I have a really beautiful or rich work of literature about our faith, let's say you're teaching religion, or if I have a really beautiful, rich work of, about astronomy, um, it, I can accomplish the same thing, right?
Right.
It, I what I just did with Little House in the Big Woods, I could do across the curriculum. That this is
Right.
not about literature.
Yes, so this is what we were when we were at UD together. This is one of the big things when we were choosing the books for each grade. We were doing that logocentric approach of what is appropriate for the age of this child to be
Absolutely.
reading. And if you're doing that and you're choosing the literature and the books, the texts that they're supposed to read at the age appropriate level, the
Yes.
students are going to guide you, the
Yes.
teacher, as to where they are as learners. Now, I know that can be challenging when you have a lot of kids in your classroom and some of them are at a like totally different reading level grade than another student, which we definitely need to talk about. But I do think that if you can step back and just trust the process, that the literature and the conversations and narrating is going to actually do the work. It's going to give the living ideas and the relational connections, and that is the curriculum. The curriculum
Yes.
is the living ideas and the relational connections. Um, and the way that you evaluate this, because then teachers want to know, how do I assess? How do I give grade? They have to give grades. They have to
Mhm.
give assessments. The
Yes.
school's requiring it, or the state funding is requiring that they gather grades, what
Mhm.
have you. They have to have a grade system. And I know that you can talk about this, but I think that if you can sort of step back
Mhm.
and then assess the students based on where they are, there are general, I put together today some classical rubrics based on a wonderful blog that I just interviewed Andrew Zwerneman yesterday
Oh,
on
yes.
his 10 for 10 how to grade seminar participation. And
Oh,
it's a wonderful essay, and it's geared for grading seminars for high school. But the principles that he has in it go
yes.
for all the grades. And so he talks about in foundation number 8 of his article, he talks about higher level habits of the mind. And he gets some of this from Adler's book, The Paideia Proposal, which is why I was looking at it. So the higher level habits of the mind are intellectual skills in learning. And he lists 4: that the student has a sense of wonder, which
Mhm.
basically means that they have an interest in learning and that the child loves to learn. So there's a rubric right
Yes.
there. That's a checklist. That's a checkbox.
Yes.
The second one is they have a depth of inquiry. Okay, so if we want a rubric for depth of inquiry, we want to see, is the child asking questions to clarify instructions? Is the child asking questions to understand content? Is the child asking meaningful questions to show the spirit of inquiry? Is the child attentive to the ideas in the lesson? And is the child able to observe and measure ideas and concepts? So that would cover depth of inquiry. Then the third level of mind
Yes.
is basic knowledge, which I have 4 different checklists for that. Then the fourth level is understanding, and so I have 5 different checklists for that. Then he goes into lower level skilled habits of work. And he goes close reading, intellectual discussions, clear communication, and disciplined engagement. And I gave each category a list of 3 or 4 checklists. And to me, this type of general rubric is really the standard. This is
Yes.
what they need for every grade, every subject, because it all has to do with educating the whole person.
Yes. A great source for like standards that actually, so they're phrased as standards, at least for Catholic schools, is Cardinal Newman Society. They have a list of
Mhm.
standards. Like one of their standards is experiences joy and wonder in nature. And that's for everybody, pre K through 12.
Is that available that we could put it on the show notes?
Yes, that's
Okay.
available for free online. We use that for our standards here at Holy Innocents.
And I'm going to put the one I just put together in the show notes because I feel like
Yes,
these are good starting places, because it does, you have the standards or the rubrics or whatever you want to call it that you can use for grading, for
yes,
assessing. They have to be living ideas as well.
yes. And I think too, so often as classical educators, we are in this kind of world of education. We're not of it, but we can be infected by it. And I think the big push in education these days is individualization, differentiation, meeting every student where they are. Every school is going to tell you that they're going to do that. And there is some sense in which a lot of maybe an initial understanding of classical education was, well, we don't do this in classical education because we believe in standards. We absolutely do believe in standards. But in terms of that there is, I'm not saying that classical schools don't say, well, nouns are nouns and verbs are verbs and students should be able to identify them. Absolutely. But that we actually believe that we have a centuries old tradition of how to cultivate human growth. The word education comes from Latin educare, to draw out. And to me, this is why the heart of that classroom is that student teacher dialogue. It's educare. We are drawing them out
Hmm.
because we are drawing them into their growth. So, shouldn't our rubrics measure their growth? And isn't that ultimately every educator, even a public educator, would agree that ultimately your students come to you with the knowledge and skills and habits that they have, and that all we can do is help them grow. If a child can't read at the start of fourth grade, well, then we have to teach him how to read,
Right.
right? And but he's, let's say he was never taught how to read. He's not less of a human being. We need to educare, we need to draw out in him what we are able to draw out. And ultimately our rubric should measure how much did he grow? How far did he come?
Right. Right.
Maybe this child grew like a weed this year. Or maybe he's a little sapling. Maybe he's not growing well. Is it the soil that he's growing in? Is it the watering? Maybe he's just not growing well. These intellectual habits. Maybe he's not asking questions and he's not engaging. And we need to have a conversation with mom and dad about why he's not growing. But ultimately, I think every educator who has been, because this is what education is, that we are the experts in the children in front of us, and that we are always learning because there are always new children in front of us, and that we need to be experts in monitoring, are they growing, how much are they growing, how fast are they growing, are there things that are limiting their growth? And in classical education, so this is where we believe in standards, and I think this is where, yes, we teach nouns are nouns and verbs are verbs, but the child who can't read isn't ready to learn what a noun is. He may be ready to learn, however, that order is a virtue. He may need new habits of order, and we can teach him those habits, right? And so I think actually this is the missing piece for a lot of teachers. It's not Little House in the Big Woods. It's that they are afraid that just reading it and narrating it
Isn't
isn't
enough.
enough.
That's right.
It's because we do not understand that our number one job is not to make Little House in the Big Woods interesting or to teach them to compare and contrast. They have a brain. It can compare and contrast. It will do that naturally. Children do this naturally. They do it at different developmental paces. Some are not ready to compare and contrast at the same level. We can't really force that. What
Right.
we can do is teach them how to pay attention.
Exactly.
We can do that. And so
Yes.
we're spending all this time focused on making them compare and contrast at the right age, which is sort of like making children in pre-K feel rhythm. Like some really feel it and some really don't. And what are we going to do? Force them to feel the rhythm? They're all at different developmental stage. We can teach them to pay attention. We can teach them that there is an orderly way to do things. We can, right? We can develop those habits. So I actually think a lot of this comes back to when we're evaluating students, we're evaluating their habits and the habits we're cultivating, and we have power to really cultivate. This is culture. This is habit. This is what school is. School
Right.
is not standards.
Right.
It's these things. And we built that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this today too, is that the primary pedagogy in classical education is mimetic. Like students are imitating.
Yes.
And so the way we can grade them is we can grade how they're responding to mimetic instruction. So are they imitating well? Are they using good words? Are when they're narrating, are they using the author's words? Are they doing some sequencing? There are definitely things within narration that can become
Oh,
a
yeah.
rubric to help a teacher get better at the skill of narrating.
Yes.
And then if you think about the art of recitation, students are reciting, saying recitations.
Yes.
Okay, so Kieran, common sense, what are some things that you would look for in a recitation so a teacher can get a grade?
So, so I'm going to come back to the habits idea because this is to me down to the little
It
things.
is down to the habits, exactly.
It's very tiny. So Can students be heard when they recite? Can all the sounds of all the words be heard? From where? From the front of the classroom? From the other side of the classroom? Um, when students recite, when they recite together, can they stay together in rhythm? Um, how focused is everyone? Could they recite it individually and in unison? These are all down to habits. This is all down to how often we practice, in what way we practice, making them do it again when it's not clear, walking to the other side of the room and saying, "Oh, I couldn't hear you. Okay, I heard a mont, but this is supposed to be a mot. Let's all practice saying t, 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 right at the right." And then I'm going to grade them on that because I just cultivated the habit of that.
Right. So basically it comes down to this. The whole overarching the whole overarching thing for every rubric, for every standard is that you're teaching them how to read, how to speak, how to think, and how to listen. Those four things. That's it.
Yes.
And so you're teaching them the habits of listening, you're teaching them the habits of speaking, you're teaching them the habits of thinking,
Mhm.
and the habit of reading. And if you're focused on those four things and you just sit down and go, okay, what are the habits of speaking we want? We want them to articulate. We want them to pronounce the words well. We want them to use good volume, good
Yeah,
rate, good cadence. So
exactly.
you just think about what makes a good speaker. Okay, what makes a good listener? So exactly, it goes back to habits. So you have to think through what are the habits you want to teach? What are the habits you want your students to walk away with? And those habits then are what guide the what would be guiding your grades, how you're going to grade
Absolutely.
them, right?
Let me give an
And
example.
measure growth, really. We want to measure growth.
Exactly. So let me give an example of something that interesting for me, and this has been a new experience for me, but I think it's actually a situation of sort of immediate feedback. So at Holy Innocents, we're a daily mass school. And, at first you don't think a lot of daily mass as part of your program, but then increasingly, daily mass is a real measure of student behavior, student habits, and you get immediate, you have sort of immediate feedback as how you're doing because student behavior, we take our entire campus, almost 300 kids, to mass every day, including our 4-year-olds. So everybody 4 years old to 18, they go. So it takes about 45 minutes. It's, because we have everybody there. And we also have our local parishioners. And you really have a sense, what are their habits like? And so I have really noticed that it's so easy as teachers to think of, well, what we're doing is daily mass. Like that's our standard. So our task is to go to mass, but we should be thinking about so much more, and we should be thinking about the habits. Um, so students need the habit of silence. We need to teach them how to be silent. Students need the habit of oral response because our priest will say to us, there's almost 400 people in here and I didn't hear anybody when I say the responses. Why am I not hearing anybody say the responses? Oh, okay. Do they not know the responses? How do we cultivate in them the habit of call and response, right? Well, and this is, of course, going to go back to the classroom. How do we need the habit of singing. Um, that they know when to sing and when to be silent, that they know we need the habit of reading because we're reading the scripture every day in mass. Are they attending? Are they following along? Are they being good active listeners? Would they be able to tell back after mass what they heard? So all of a sudden we have realized every little habit when we walk into the room matters. How we seat them matters. How we what we tell them before mass, what we tell them after mass. The mass itself is actually an evaluation for the habits we're cultivating all the rest of the day.
That's right. That's
And it
so
has
true.
shown us, if we're not really teaching them call and response, let's say like our younger grades who do phonics lessons, they're actually really good at the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. They know a teacher says, they talk to you, you respond. But maybe some of our older students have gotten out of the habit of looking in the eye and responding to someone. How do we cultivate that in our classes? Well, we need more seminar. We need
Right.
to look in the eye and speak to the seminar. When we read aloud to students, are we having them narrate? Or are they just passive listeners? Because then they're going to be passive listeners and they're going to go to mass for days and they're not going to be able to tell us what the reading was. So we need to cultivate active listeners. Narration is going to cultivate this where they know once we read this, I need to be able to tell you what it is.
Right.
Um, if our kindergartners don't know when to be silent and when to talk, we're just going to have chaos, right? And so I think in that sense, to me, it's really shown me when we are grading, we're evaluating habits. And this, again, so coming back to that idea of logocentric, this is why a curriculum that is grounded in the personal relationships, the living ideas, which what that looks like for your year is okay, what books will my fourth graders read? What nature are we going to look at? Because again, this is actually much more complex than we might initially think. Stargazing trips with, preschoolers are a lot more difficult than stargazing trips with fourth or fifth graders. So that's probably appropriate for fifth graders, but not for preschoolers, right? For preschoolers, we're going to look at the tree that grows right next door to our school. We're going to know that tree because that's easy for them to, that can be part of
Mhm.
their curriculum. But when we approach it from that perspective, what we're evaluating is how well the student is engaging in, responding, and learning to the habits of growth we're cultivating around that curriculum.
Mhm.
We can't force we can't force them to grow faster than they grow. And I think that
That's a good point.
a lot of contemporary education is actually trying to force children to grow when sometimes they're not ready, and they all grow at different rates. Um, and most of
Hmm.
them, if you have a kindergartner who's not reading yet, that's okay. But if you have a kindergartner who is reading it, that's also okay. Now, the sort of contemporary standards based education, all of a sudden that's not okay to have
Right.
both of those kids in the room.
Yeah, and that's another thing is if a teacher is feeling like what standard am I supposed to be doing when I'm teaching history to third graders? Well, I feel like maybe that's not the right question.
No, it's not the right question because you should be asking what habits of learning are my third graders learning across the curriculum? And history is one of many, again, to go with Charlotte Mason's analogy, because it's a perfect analogy, one of many dishes I'm presenting with. We should not just feed them sandwiches, right? If the sandwiches are literature, they can't just live off of sandwiches. We should give them a varied diet of the mind in the same way we give them a varied diet of the stomach. But ultimately, we are evaluating the same thing in all of those subjects, which is their personal and intellectual habits. And I actually think the concept of intellectual habits is one of the ones that we have lost so much in our culture, or even the idea that there is an intellectual virtue, that children will have cultivated the intellectual virtue of paying attention to detail, that this is an intellectual virtue that we must cultivate. And that we cultivate it when we ask them to provide details when we narrate. So our rubric says provided details, and that students who are just beginning to learn to pay attention to detail in third grade, maybe it's one or two, but that by the time we have high schoolers, we should be asking them to cite specific sources and provide details for their argument every time they speak or write or read. But that's across the curriculum. That's true in biology. That's true in literature. That's true in
It's
history.
it's true in third grade literature they should be able to cite back to the text. I mean,
Exactly.
so like you can have a standard in seventh grade that says a student should be able to cite back to the text. No, they should be able to do that when they're in third grade too.
Exactly.
So I mean, like if like my example of the one little boy that I was reading Sarah Courage of Sarah Noble to when he was 8, and I asked him to narrate, and the chapter was on the dad. It was like chapter 3 in the book or whatever. I've read that book enough. And I said, "Well, can you tell me what you remember about that chapter?" And he goes, "Well, the dad was a country man, and that's it." And I said, "Okay,
No.
how do you know he was a country man?" So guess what I did? I made him go back to the text,
Yes.
and he was like, "Oh, because he da 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 da," and he just went on and narrated the whole chapter with all the details because he was
Yes.
able to recite back what the text had said. And
Exactly.
so if you limit like the mistake I see in a lot of schools that do focus on the standard checklist is they think, "Oh, I don't have to cover that till 7th grade, so it doesn't really matter." Or
Yes.
they're in 3rd grade, they don't really know how to do that yet. Well, then that's actually cheapening their humanness
Oh,
because
yes.
all human beings can do this.
Mhm. Well, I want to translate this word habit into virtue. If all of a sudden you think of these things as intellectual virtues, no
There you go.
one gets a free pass to be virtuous. No one says third graders don't have to be virtuous. Now, what virtue they're going to grow in their ability to be virtuous in different ways, but I mean, honesty is honesty. Now, We all know that sometimes very young children, they're trying to be honest and they actually end up saying something that's not entirely true because they're still learning how to speak. But honesty is honesty. They still can't be dishonest, right? And so in the same way that like a third grader, yeah, they have to cite the text. They need to have the intellectual habit of paying attention to detail.
Right.
They are going to grow in the depth of this virtue in the same way that they will grow in the depth of their virtues of honesty and prudence and humility. But and it's our job to cultivate those virtues. That's what we're doing because we are in the business of drawing out of educating these children into full human beings. And so I think to me the best way to think of standards is a crutch. I think it's a misconception about classical education that we don't teach the standards. We teach everything that's in the standards. We're going to teach them better. We're going to teach it more thoroughly. We're going to teach it with more differentiation. But in order to truly do that well, we have to ask a different question. We have to start from a different standpoint. We have to think about the whole picture, the whole big picture. Okay. And I think that is the piece that I don't know to me that's the piece that we miss is that when we get focused only on the standards, we actually miss what we should be learning, which is our children.
Right. So what is the right question?
To me, the question is developmentally, this age that I'm teaching, where are they ready to grow? How am I going to help them grow? And what feast am I going to present for them that will help them grow? So, when we think about feeding our children, right? We all think about the plate, like they need protein, they need carbs, but neither do we think about it in such a constricted way as like, well, I'm just going to feed them a protein shake. But sometimes we have to do that, right? But that we're going to think about, in fact, when you think about nutrition, going to think about the colors on the plate, the size that you cut the food, right? You're going to think about what nutrients does this child need, and you're not just going to serve them little nutrient pills in order to do that. You're going to create an attractive plate of food that they are going to want to eat, and you're going to have to think about all of that. So we're going to ask, what feast am I going to give them of learning, intellectual feasts,
And that's the
and
curriculum.
that's the curriculum, and where are they ready to grow? That what virtues do they need to cultivate, and that is actually going to be different with each class because I think
Ye-
something that sometimes we don't understand. If you get a group of fourth graders in and they have really advanced intellectual habits, classical education does not say, "Oh, I'm done. I've met the standards." We say, "Okay, let's keep growing."
Right. Now, here's the question, Kiernan. How do you do that when you have mixed levels in one classroom?
I think first of all, on the one hand, most children, most 10-year-olds have certain things in common in terms of their development, right?
Hmm.
On the other hand, um, when we present a feast, going with the food analogy, to me to say, well, how do we deal with the varied levels is to say, can short children and tall children eat the same meal? Well, of course they can. they're both going to get the nutrients that they need out of it. Once in a blue moon, you have a child who has some pretty extreme nutrition needs. They might need a lot more protein or a lot more carbohydrates, right? But by and large, a balanced diet feeds all children in different ways. And so the same thing is true. That's why living books and ideas are at the center of the curriculum, because it will feed all of them in the ways that they need, right? Um, no one has reached the limit of the carnival of the animals, to take a musical piece. No one has reached the limit of everything to know about this tree. No one has hit their limit on those things, but preschool children they're going to access what they need from the tree in the same way that they will from their sandwich or their hamburger or their chicken and rice, right? And the 12th graders will access what they need from the tree, which may be that they're going to put the leaf under a microscope, or right, that is actually where the differentiation is happening, is in that curriculum, that feast of living ideas and relational connections.
Right. Well, and even their response to it is going to be different, and that's going to help guide you into what is they're ready for.
Yes,
Because the older
absolutely.
kids are, well, everybody likes to analyze details, but when they get a little older, they may want to actually dive into the details even more. I
Yeah,
mean, but honestly, I've seen 5 and 3-year-olds do that too.
I
So
know.
my 3-year-old granddaughter, she goes into the details and wants to know every little thing about every story I'm reading
Yep,
to her. And
yep,
she listens to, like, she's 3, just turned 3, and The Story of Holly and Ivy by Rumor Godden is her favorite book. And it's
yep,
pretty long.
it
And
is.
she's like, "Okay, where's the little boy? Where's the toy shop? I need to see the toy shop." And I'll tell her it's around the corner in the picture. And, "Oh, it's around the corner in the picture, Grandmama?" And she'll go, "Is the girl with the red dress in the picture?" And I'm like, "Yes, she is, but we can't see it.
Yep.
But we know in our mind she's there." And I went to read it to her the other day, and I couldn't remember. She goes, "Where's the little boy?" And I said, "I don't remember. I don't know where he is. He's not in the picture." And I go, "I don't even remember his name." And she goes, "Oh, his name is Peter." She remembered his name.
I
Like,
love it.
she remembered so much more.
I
And
know.
I have read that book like at least a dozen times because I read it to kids all the time and to my kids. I've read it to her twice, and she remembers that his name is Peter, and I don't remember. But
Wow.
I mean,
I love it.
it's just there's so I think that when you relax and you enjoy the curriculum with the
Yes,
students and you model loving learning,
yes,
what happens is it creates an atmosphere where the students feel safe to ask questions and to really establish that spirit of inquiry. And that's where then in that atmosphere becomes so beautiful and
yeah,
full of joy
it's so
that
true.
the real learning ends up happening. And then those habits get cultivated because other students they
Yeah.
realize they want to be a part of the conversation, so they start to listen better.
Exactly, exactly.
And then
That's
the
mimetic too.
journaling, notebooking is so important.
Oh,
Notebooking is
yes.
such a great way for the students to capture and learn the skills of observing and
Yes.
recording and asking questions. And so I know we're out of time, but I do want to ask at least how the question, Kiernan, our $1 million question, how do you grade this? Do you guys have a system at your school? What do you suggest for how you grade this?
I mean, I think we're working on a system. I think the biggest piece is rubrics, like you were talking about, rubrics that are individual and centered around those. One thing I tell my teachers is I want to see that you are evaluating students by having them talk in seminar and having them write written narrations all the way up to these full essays, and that you should have rubrics that are evaluating how they're meeting standards like in the Cardinal Newman standards, their wonder, their inquiry, their depth of attention to detail, the rigor of their logic, things like that,
Hmm.
that are evaluating that. So those assessments are holistic. They're not looking at what individual multiple choice questions they got right or wrong or things like that. And those assessments are going to evaluate their growth over the
Hmm.
years. We're going to see them grow from these written narrations in third grade to their beautiful senior thesis in fifth
And
grade. So that's
obviously,
what we're
like,
moving towards.
I mean, obviously, math is easier to grade,
Yeah,
phonics is easier to grade.
even there, my math teacher, one thing I love is he has a whole emphasis on the art of problem solving and the steps of solving a problem. And so a big part of your grade is how did you solve it and can you explain how you solved it? So
Hmm.
I'm going to have to go, but
Yes. Well, this was
thank
great.
you
We
so much.
might have to have you back on if people ask a lot of questions and want to know more, because we could talk for 2 more hours, I'm sure.
Amen. We could. We could.
All right. Thank you so much, Kieran.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups// classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."